It's an honor to introduce the Secretary of State for the state of Michigan, the Honorable Jocelyn Benson. Secretary Benson will speak to us and then take questions. So during the talk, please submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Secretary Benson is the former Dean of Wayne State University Law School in Detroit, where she's still an associate professor. She's an expert on civil rights law, education law, and importantly for today, election law. And she's the author of the book, State Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process. She's also served as CEO of the Ross Initiative in Sports for Equality, a national nonprofit organization using the unifying power of sports to improve race relations. You've likely seen Jocelyn Benson in the national spotlight, participating in interviews and leading discussions about the election recently held in November in our country and about election security in Michigan and across the US. I reached out to her because I recognized that she had something important to say about these issues, and she says it well. She's also among the public officials who tragically have endured personal threats from those who allege fraud in the last election. Jocelyn, we thank you for joining us, knowing that you were raised nearby in Canonsburg. I hope you think of this as something of a virtual homecoming. Welcome to W&J.
Thank you. Thank you. And it most definitely is. As I mentioned to you, my mother attended classes at W&J, and I have very distinct memories of coming to the campus as a young girl. So it is very much a wonderful homecoming and great to connect with all of you today. I did grow up in Canonsburg and moved to Michigan after law school, but Pennsylvania is still home in many ways. And so it's great to be here today. And thank you for also hosting this important dialogue. I'm proud to be a part of it. And, you know, as you mentioned, our democracy was tested last year, not just by a historic, unprecedented misinformation campaign, but also in the midst of a global pandemic. And there were real questions throughout the year as we prepared for November about how we would both ensure that every citizen knew their options to vote, build an infrastructure that would ensure that no matter what option they chose, it was safe, accessible, and secure, and then protect the security of the process. And at first, the security protections meant protecting the infrastructure from actual infiltration or hacking. But it soon became clear to all of us, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and other election administrators throughout the country at the local level, that the real and the most significant threat to the security of our elections was a misinformation campaign, efforts to hack the voters' minds, and that leading up to the election could lead them to not vote or not know their options for voting. And of course, after the election, cause them to question the results and the security of the process. So battling that perception, that very well-orchestrated PR campaign following the election designed to sow seeds of doubt among the electorate about the sanctity of the process was a key component of administering elections last year, but it's certainly not something that was typical in any means. And so, you know, today I'm going to share a few insights on how in Michigan and as well as in states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, we worked at the state level to overcome the challenges that democracy faced last year, how we prevailed, because we did prevail, despite the deep challenges, and how we worked to protect the will of our voters despite really an unprecedented scenario. And I look forward to questions and further discussion and talking about what we experienced, with the emphasis that what we experienced in Michigan was not unlike a lot of what you all experienced in Pennsylvania and my colleagues in Arizona and other states as well. And so our lessons learned are informative for all states and certainly unique as well to the year that we spent. And I think, you know, the first thing to begin with is a recognition that the 2020 election was the most secure in our nation's history. And in Michigan, it was also the most successful election in our state's recent history. And we determined that, we measured that really on two key metrics. One, and to what extent did people participate? And two, was the election secure? And on that first metric, we saw more people vote on both sides of the aisle than ever before in our state. And that was a great thing. And the fact that that happened even in the midst of a global pandemic, that all the ballots were received and counted and tabulated efficiently and effectively and securely was really an extraordinary success, and one that we lived through, meaning that every moment we were aware of all the variables, everything that could have perhaps not gone well. We were prepared with contingency plans along the way for everything. But the other piece of our experience in Michigan and elsewhere was that a lot of what we feared prior to the election could come, or on election day would come to pass, didn't actually come to pass. And I think a big reason why that was because we were prepared, or because the bar was so high and the impact was so low for those who might seek to, prior to the election, try anything, that we were able to effectively protect the election itself and our voters from any shenanigans leading up to and on election day itself. And we did that, and I'm going to talk about what happened when things turned. And things turned in Michigan late in the day on Wednesday, the day after the election day. Coincidentally, right around the time in which national networks began to call Michigan's presidential campaign for the now President Joe Biden, that's when things took a turn and became particularly challenging. But up until that point, up until that moment, things were remarkably smooth. We worked with election administrators across the state so that they could meet every challenge thrown to them up to that point, and carried out a very intensive public education campaign to ensure every voter knew their options and how to vote, and could have faith that no matter what option they chose, they would be able to know that their vote had been counted. In Michigan, we focused on how people were getting their ballots and how people were able to return their ballots. People could get their ballots by picking them up at their clerk's office, requesting them to be mailed to them, picking them up at a satellite clerk's office, particularly in our urban areas, or voting in person on election day and getting their ballot then. So one, we taught people, or we educated people on how to get their ballots. And then on the other side of that, we created many options for ballot return. Of course, going through the mail was one, going to a drop box, and we placed over 1,000 drop boxes all across the state, and dropping it off there by 8 p.m. on election day was another. Dropping it off in person at your clerk's office, or returning it or voting in person on election day. So making sure voters knew those options, and that clerks were again prepared to ensure the security of all those options through signature checks and identification requirements, was how we made sure both voters knew what to do, and that election administrators were prepared to embrace whatever choice voters made to ensure their voices were heard and their votes were counted. And the result was very successful. 5.5 million Michigan citizens voted. That was an 11% increase from the 2008 record, which at that point was the highest turnout we'd seen, and an additional 500,000 voters that didn't vote in 2008 voted in 2020. So it was an extraordinary success in that regard. And of that, 3.3 million voted prior to election day, or returned their ballots absentee, or through the mail, or in a drop box at their clerk's office, without going to the polls. That was more than double the previous record, which had been set just a few months before in our August primary. And it was 3 times the number of people who voted absentee from the 2016 November election. So extraordinary success. And of course, we were proud. We were very focused on making sure those ballots were counted effectively and efficiently. And unlike other states, we were very pleased that within 24 hours of the polls closing, the unofficial results were complete and the tabulation was done. That was Wednesday night. That was 2 days ahead of time. We had assumed, based on our calculations and what we knew was happening in other states like Pennsylvania and Arizona and Georgia, that it would similarly take us through Friday to tabulate every vote in ballot, in particular because our clerks were not able to begin tabulating those ballots prior to election day, just like in Pennsylvania. So based on sure numbers, 3.3 million absentee ballots, can't start counting them until 7 a.m. or even processing them until 7 a.m. on election day. We anticipated it could take through Friday to tabulate everyone, but nevertheless, we tried to mitigate that by doubling and in some cases tripling the number of voting machines and people. We recruited over 30,000 new election workers, trained them, put them in particularly our most densely populated areas to increase the speed, capacity, and efficiency of that tabulation, knowing not just that the public wanted it, but more importantly to us, there would be, we knew, an effort to sow seeds of doubt among the electorate from the moment those polls closed to the moment we had those unofficial results. And the best way we could mitigate against efforts to cause doubt in our elections during that tabulation time, or have the potential. And everyone was asking me at that time, what happens if one of the candidates claimed victory prior to the results being out? And we said, we had a plan, which was essentially to tabulate as fast as possible, but also keep people updated. And we did that. So within 24 hours of the polls closing, we were able to have our unofficial results. And as I mentioned, that was really when things turned. Interestingly, I feel that there was probably a plan in place, an assumption, because we saw this play out in Pennsylvania and Arizona, that people would have more time to sow seeds of doubt during the tabulation process, assuming it would have taken us through Friday. So it wasn't until, as I mentioned, Wednesday night, when people began to show up outside Cobo Hall protesting, which was where the absentee ballot tabulation was happening for the city of Detroit. And that escalated once the results, the unofficial results, began being announced on the news. But it also became clear to us that there may have been plans in place for Thursday and Friday that we in Michigan were able to undermine because our results and our unofficial results were announced on Wednesday night. So I considered that a success and considered that something that, despite many, many weeks that followed of a misinformation campaign and efforts to continue to undermine the people's voices and the people's votes in Michigan and throughout the country, our infrastructure worked, our plan worked. Every valid vote was counted, and it was counted efficiently and securely. And we saw, again, more people believe in the process by participating than ever before in our state. So now, moving forward, the work is to continue those successes, build on what worked, prepare for a more permanent creation of the parts that work, permanent normalcy of the aspects of our elections in 2020 that worked, like ensuring citizens have equal access to request to vote absentee if that's what they want. So normalizing what worked based on the data and the facts and voters' behavior through legislation and other policy changes, and also continuing to push back and correct the ongoing effort that still is continuing, though perhaps not at as great of intensity as before, to confuse people or cause them to doubt the reality, which was that the Michigan's elections, just as Pennsylvania's, Georgia's, Arizona's, and every other state's, the results of our elections were accurate, an accurate reflection of the will of the people. And to me, my heart breaks for those who don't believe that, who may believe that for whatever reason, based on no evidence, but simply because elected officials are saying it to further their own political agendas. My heart breaks for those who believe that that misinformation, those lies, because it's simply just not true. And we succeed when everyone believes that their vote counts, which is the truth, that their vote matters, which is the truth, and that the results of our elections are accurate, even if it doesn't go the way that you wanted for your particular candidate. So in my view, moving forward, we have to continue to be clear that misinformation campaigns are just that, misinformation. They're lies manufactured and disseminated to further political agenda and reduce faith in our elections. And we can't continue. We know those who would seek to say other things continue to say other things. And so it's important that we all continue to speak the truth and call out the falsehoods as they continue to arise. In Michigan, it happened just yesterday when the state Senate Majority Leader talked about dead people voting in Michigan, which wasn't the case, which didn't happen, which there's no evidence that it happened. And yet again, we all have to get on social media and do the work again to remind people of what the truth is. So that work is going to keep happening. That work's going to be ongoing. And we can't allow that misinformation to cloud the reality of last year's elections, which was, again, an extraordinary success with more people voting in a secure election than ever before. And the bottom line is moving forward, normalizing a lot of the techniques that work, taking the burden off our election administrators who arose to great lengths last year to meet the needs of the electorate and the election, making sure they have more funding, more time to tabulate ballots, more support, more educational opportunities, making sure those who observe elections, the challengers on both sides of the aisle, the poll workers, have more educational opportunities as well. A lot of the problems we saw in Michigan was because people were observing what happened. I know this happened in Philadelphia as well, and weren't properly educated on what they may be seeing, allowing false perceptions to take hold and percolate. So this month, I introduced a legislative agenda to address these and other issues, essentially advancing our work, advancing the vote, protecting democracy by further expanding access, strengthening our elections infrastructure, and bolstering election security. The proposals, which you can find on our website, are a collection of best practices that the data and voter behavior from 2020 illustrates and informs that we need in Michigan to continue to build on our successes for future elections. It calls on our state legislature to make Election Day a state holiday, not necessarily to impact participation rates, because we know that's not the case, but in a state like ours, where people can vote absentee up to 40 days prior to Election Day, making Election Day one where people can take off work to work at the polls, which was something that enabled us to have success this year, is a good thing, and it's something that we want to craft legislation to protect. We want to ensure every voter is mailed an absentee ballot application prior to every federal election cycle, so that they have in their hands information on how to request and vote absentee if they choose to do so. We want to allow absentee ballots that are postmarked by Election Day but arrive shortly thereafter to be counted. We know in many states like Florida and Ohio, where this is the law and the norm, it saves more people from being inadvertently disenfranchised through no fault of their own because the post office delays mail. We also want to prohibit election misinformation that intentionally is designed to deter or mislead voters, and ban guns within 100 feet of a voting location to, again, protect voters from voter intimidation. I mentioned these items in our legislative agenda because they demonstrate that security and freedom need not collide, that you can actually accomplish great things through an election administration system of policies that protect access to the vote and protect the security of the vote. Many of us at the Secretary of State level call this making it easier to vote and harder to cheat, which really captures what bipartisan data-driven election reforms can look like that benefit all voters and ensure that everyone has a voice and a stake in our democracy and a system. And so, in my view, the choice before us now is to move forward and embrace the challenges of protecting our democracy that these past few months illuminated for us. We don't have to choose necessarily between access to the vote and security of the vote. That is clearly a false choice. It's rather about building a system to tailor our needs for both, to ensure that our democracy prevails and continues to prevail. So finding that balance, looking at the data and the facts and the truth, and working from the same set of facts and evidence and truth to devise better practices moving forward, to build on successes and make improvements where we can, is really the key to ensure that we don't live through what we've just lived through over the past 3 months, which was an extraordinary burden on our democratic process, on our democracy, and one that I know our country survived. But we should work in every way possible, and we can avoid that or reoccurrence of what happened in the future. So thank you again for having me here today. There is work to do moving forward. That's why these conversations are so important. A lot of times after elections, people move on, as oftentimes the policy makers do, to focus on other issues, and as they should. But we can't ignore the real challenges to our democracy that were illuminated and revealed over the past few months, nor can we ignore the real successes that we experienced, because we have much to learn from both. And by learning from both and moving forward together, we can ensure that our democracy remains strong well into the future.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and really appreciate not only the retrospective on the election, but some forward-looking thinking about ways that we might effect change for the future. You mentioned in your words that your heart breaks for those who believe that there was massive election fraud in November. And I know that I've seen reports that you're working in a bipartisan way with other secretaries of state to take on measures that might reassure the public of election integrity if there are those who doubt it. We actually have a question from Juliana who says, how do you feel we could build trust in those who don't have faith in election integrity? And is there anything we could do, which I take to mean we as individuals could do in addition to what you may be doing in public policy?
Yes, there's a number of things that we all can do and that we need everyone to do to really restore faith and ensure all people have rightfully placed faith in the integrity of our elections. The first is for all of us. I look at it as 3 things. First, we need to call upon our leaders to tell the truth, because a lot of this misinformation is continuing to percolate because elected officials and others in places of authority continue to repeat it. And so staying vigilant and continuing to respond with to misinformation with facts and truth is a burden that we're going to have to continue to bear long into the future. Secondly, to those on the receiving end of that misinformation who are believing it or perhaps choosing to believe it, I think it's important to have conversations, to listen, to understand and strip away some of the perhaps rhetorical or hyperbolic positions, but actually kind of get at the heart of what those fears that they have may be, and recognize that, look, 2020 was a year where nearly everyone experienced great fear or uncertainty in many ways through the multiple crises our country lived through, the social political crises, the electoral crises, the economic crises, of course, the public health crisis. So recognizing that we're all in the state of uncertainty and fear, and that actually creates a fertile breeding ground for misinformation to take hold. Listen to folks, have conversations, understand where they're coming from, and recognize that we both, I believe, in most cases, not with everyone, but in many, want to get to a place where even if someone disagrees with the outcome of the election, they still have a rightful evidence-based faith in the results. And so talking through that, those conversations may not always be successful, but this is what one of the things, particularly those in an educational community, have a unique responsibility and opportunity in your in the community that you've built around the university, around the college, to actually foster those deeper conversations and learn from each other, so that we can avoid even a repeat of this from happening again. And then the third thing that can be done is to recognize that our democracy prevailed in no small part due to the election administrators and those who stood up to be poll workers, making sure that people got their ballots, were able to return their ballots, and the ballots were tabulated effectively and securely. That's why we succeeded. That's why it worked, because people in the process did their jobs with integrity. And so whether it's electing secretaries of state or local clerks or local election administrators who are committed to doing their work with integrity, not with regard to partisanship, you as voters have the power, in particularly at the local level in Pennsylvania, to influence those decisions and to make sure those decisions are made with your values in mind, with democracy in mind is important. And then serving as poll workers as well, being one of the people in the system that is protecting democracy, protecting the vote of all, the voice of all voters, is something to consider as well. Because we had so many people serving as poll workers, we didn't have to close down precincts. We were able to tabulate ballots effectively and efficiently. And that made all the difference in the end. So there's work that you can do to play a role, to speak the truth, and to really be a part of progress moving forward in all those ways.
Great. Thanks for those really constructive suggestions of things that people can do. I think in times like this, we all want to do our part. And we often don't know if there's anything an individual can do that would make a difference. You mentioned 2020 and the fear and uncertainty that sort of swirled around us through the year. Ron is asking, how did the pandemic affect the security of the election?
Well, it affected our preparation for the election. It actually didn't affect the security, in that we had, in terms of protecting the machines, protecting the infrastructure, protecting our voter rolls from efforts to hack them, and all these things we've been prepared for. We were still prepared for those. What it essentially did was almost give us more time to protect the infrastructure, because we were all working from home, and it increased efficiencies with protecting the actual hardware of the infrastructure itself. It created some specific challenges with the infrastructure, not related to election security, but just personnel. Traditional poll workers, we could not necessarily rely on to serve for multiple different ways. They chose not to. It created, of course, a health dynamic for people voting in person. We needed to provide and ensure there was PPE for all of our election workers, and that voters were wearing masks as well, so we could maintain polling places as safe places to vote. And we needed to ensure voters knew that they could vote without leaving their home in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and Arizona and many other states, and that they knew exactly how to do that and could have faith that if they chose that route, their vote would count. So in Michigan, we actually had 2 elections prior to November where we were able to test different things out. Mailing applications, for example, for voters to vote absentee was something we did in both of those elections. And we immediately saw voters on both sides of the aisle embrace that. And we saw how it helped our clerks prepare, because when people were getting applications ahead of time, they could request them sooner. And the more time clerks had to turn around those requests, to validate them and then send out a ballot and then get that ballot back and make sure it was tabulated effectively and securely, that all took time. And if someone requested their ballot at the last minute, and if a lot of people requested their ballots at the last minute, that would have created a backlog or a logjam that could have created many problems. So different things like that we were able to test out and plan for. And that is also, I mean, for us, we assumed that the pandemic, when it hit in March, would be unchanged in November. We just, I mean, and we said oftentimes we hoped for the best, but planned for the worst, and that we would be much better off if we just assumed running an election in May was replicable to running an election in pandemic in November, because there was no clear path for emerging out of it to us at that point. And so that enabled us to spend essentially those entire 6 months or 7 months from March to October, testing, piloting, preparing. We had local elections. We had an August primary to see how things played out. We noticed in the August primary that about 6,000 or so ballots were postmarked prior to Election Day, but received after Election Day. And we broke that down by communities and then targeted education efforts to make sure, and put drop boxes in those communities to make sure they had alternatives to get their ballots in on time for November. And so different things like that were ways in which the pandemic both impacted our work, but that we worked to prepare, adapt, and adjust, and ultimately succeed in still managing an election in the midst of a pandemic. And just as a sort of asterisk to all of that, I think in reflecting back, and now as we have time to do that, about our work leading up to November and the work of election officials and the work around the country, it was extraordinary. It was historic. The fact that we were able to pull off a November election with massive turnout, more people voting by mail than ever before all across the country, with all of the challenges and all of the uncertainties, and succeed in an effectively, securely, efficiently tabulated vote within a few days of the polls closing, that is, and history will show that was just a historical achievement. And what happened after that to undermine people's voices is certainly top of mind right now in the misinformation. But as we continue to work through that and mitigate and prepare or defend against that more in the future, I hope what will emerge is the real story of the 2020 elections, which was that we did it. And we election administrators all around the country, we actually did it. We ran a massive election in the midst of a pandemic where more people voted than ever before, and it worked. And that's a thing that should give us all a strong faith that our democratic system is indeed one that can withstand some of the greatest challenges our country has ever endured.
There are many things here at the college that we recognize are likely to be lessons learned from the pandemic that may have value in the future, like innovative uses of technology, doing what we're doing right now, for example, to bring a noted speaker to campus. Any lessons emerging from this that you would say, because of the pandemic, we actually have learned some things that we can put to use to run elections better in the future?
Yeah, I would say three things. Number one, funding is key. The fact that we were able to, a lot of our success was due to the CARES Act funding and a number of other things, but we can't continue. We must invest in our infrastructure on many levels, including in our democracy infrastructure, financially at the federal and state level. That's a key lesson learned moving forward for particularly survival of a election system in the midst of a pandemic. Second is voter education. That we all have a role in making sure we know the rules, especially if they rapidly change. And we saw a number of things emerge and change as the system sought to adapt to running an election in the pandemic. So we all have a role to play in being engaged, in being educated, and even stepping up, perhaps as serving as a poll worker. And then the third thing that I would say the experience underscores is how important it is to make data-driven decisions about running elections, not political ones. You can't run elections thinking, how is this going to make X number of voters vote better in this community, or looking at through a partisan lens in any way. You have to essentially follow the data, follow the best practices. And that's essentially what we did in Michigan and in many other states, because a lot of these problems had already been solved in different contexts and different scenarios. And if we just learn from that, we can move quickly to adapt and adjust and implement the best solutions and then succeed. But there's no space for politics in that work. And the more we can remove politics and partisanship from the work of administering elections, the better we are able to protect democracy in every scenario.
Adam is asking if you can talk about efforts to allow automatic voter registration both in Michigan and nationwide.
Yeah, in Michigan, we have automatic voter registration. We were able to implement it in 5 months. Voters enacted it in our state constitution in 2018. When I took office in January of 2019, we realized that we had an election in May. And under the Constitution, we were required to have some element of automatic voter registration in place by then. We also knew we had this massive November election coming in just 2 years, and all the work that was going to go into that. And we knew that it took other states like California 2 years to implement automatic voter registration. So, we had a lot of conversations, collected all the data and the best practices, and then our Bureau of Elections went to work on implementing it. Now, Michigan, because the Secretary of State's office oversees elections, as well as the DMV, or the Department of Motor Vehicles, we were able to, kind of effectively administer and upgrade the software to enable those interacting with the DMV or our branch offices to automatically be registered to vote, and also to have actually created 6 levels of verifications in place to protect the system from ineligible people being inadvertently registered, which we knew was important. And so we did that. We created those sort of 6 pieces to protect against ineligible people from being registered, number of checks along the way at every level. And we upgraded the software. We trained all the employees on how to do it. And essentially we're able to hit the go button in 5 months, and ultimately full blast in September of 2019. That resulted in 250,000 people being registered to vote and participating that otherwise may not have been registered for the November election. But it also had a very important side element, a side benefit that we recognized really early on as we went through the process and began its implementation, which was that every time someone comes into our offices to update their driver's license or interact with our office in any way, their voter registration is checked, because they're automatically, if eligible, registered at that time. And so what that does is create an ongoing kind of continuous cleaning of the voter rolls, meaning that we're constant, whereas typically a voter roll may be stagnant and no one really looks at it or checks at it, or if someone updates their driver's license, it doesn't automatically populate to the voter roll, creating a discrepancy. Automatic voter registration is implemented in Michigan, actually enables us to update continuously the voter file with accurate information and voter data as the DMV gets it. And so that was not anticipated because we're focusing on getting more people registered, but it's also increased the accuracy of our voter rolls and created essentially a system of consistently updating the rolls to consistently increase that accuracy, which is a great thing as well. And something that it was a unexpected benefit and a very cost-effective one at ensuring the integrity of the process.
We have a question asking, how can we ensure polling stations are accessible to all Americans and properly placed in neighborhoods that are underserved to make voting equal across the populace?
It's so important to make sure that we meet voters where they are, no matter if someone wants to vote from home, if someone wants to vote by mail, if someone wants to vote at their clerk's office, or if someone wants to vote at their local polling place, that they have access to information on how to choose the option that's best for them. So number one, making sure voters have those options and they're educated on how to use them is step one. For those who choose to vote in person at their polling places, making sure those polling places are accessible on public transportation places, and sort of there's lots of data, particularly from the Election Assistance Commission, about how to make them physically accessible for individuals with disabilities or limited abilities. So lots of things to do there in terms of actually placing them. But then is the question of who makes the decision of where those are located. And the answer to that is, of course, local election administrators. However, there's a secondary, so making sure local election administrators are making these decisions, fully informed, best practices, all of that. But also recognizing that the federal government has historically had a role to play as well in that in certain parts of the country through the Voting Rights Act, and making sure that if polling places were moved to less convenient areas, that had to be approved by the Justice Department prior to the move of the precinct. Now, when the Supreme Court a few years ago decimated the Voting Rights Act, they eliminated that pre-clearance provision that required that approval, but that underscores why that was so important, because it kept bad actors from moving election polling places from to less accessible areas by involving the the federal government and having them overrule that. And so that's really underscores why reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, strengthening it yet again to add that additional layer of protection for voters is so important. And one of the things that moving forward we can hope to see Congress do so that polling places, even at the local level, continue to be accessible to all.
Nick is asking, as the Michigan state government is currently involved with a lawsuit to disbar attorneys who perpetrated election fraud, how far should we go to ensure that false claims of election fraud are not widespread again in upcoming elections?
Well, there's a number of things that can be done. And of course, the Michigan Attorney General has been very clear that if you're going to have the privilege of being able to practice law in the state of Michigan, you can't abuse that privilege by spreading false information, intentionally so, designed to erode the public's confidence in our elections, as opposed to actually sincerely get at any real irregularities in the process. And so building off of that, I proposed legislation to ban deceptive practices in elections. And what that is a very narrowly tailored solution to both protect freedom of speech, but much in the same way that you can't wear campaign literature in polling places or incite violence or a number of other things that there's parameters around. If you intentionally knowingly mislead a voter about their rights and it has the impact of affecting the voter's exercise of those rights, that should be illegal, that there should be ramifications for that and accountability there. And so actually having a policy to draw a line in the sand that says intentional misuse and misleading the public to further a political agenda that has the result of dissuading someone from voting is an actionable violation of the law, and to really create that standard so that moving forward we can avoid repeats of what we've just experienced in the future.
Here's a question of a more personal nature that I think has probably been on the minds of a number of us. And the question is, how did you handle the personal attacks that you received for your efforts to ensure a safe and secure election?
Well, it's a great question, and one that unfortunately not just myself, but a number of election administrators like Kathy Bookvar, like Secretary Raffensperger, and a number of others had to deal with. To me, it was, I looked to behind me, I have a picture, if you could see it, of 18 or 20 secretaries of state gathered at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. We went there in May of 2019, crossed the bridge together to recognize the history that we all have a responsibility for continuing. And that throughout that history, there's been, unfortunately, more evidence than not that in being engaged in protecting access to the vote, registering people to vote, protecting our democracy sometimes engenders violence. And particularly in a scenario where we are in Michigan, where our governor, the attorney general, and myself were the targets of significant, and as well as lawmakers in our state capital, significant, we were on the receiving end of a lot of violent and hateful rhetoric and threats throughout the year. It was really of no surprise to me that, one Saturday in December, people showed up outside my home. But going through that actually was another thing, because you realize the vulnerability of yourself in that moment. And you also realize, particularly when individuals are armed, how easily something could go awry, leading to great tragedy. In that moment, you're grateful for law enforcement. We're always grateful for law enforcement. You're grateful for law enforcement for coming through, for protecting you. In my case, the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, was extraordinary in stepping up and ensuring that that evidence was collected, that there were ramifications, and that we were doing everything we could to protect the health and safety of our family and the families around us in the neighborhood. But to also just recognize a couple of things in that moment, which was that people weren't necessarily attacking me or other secretaries of state or election administrators who have been on the receiving ends of these threats. They were attacking our voters. They were protesting democracy. And just as those attacking others who stood on the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge to protect democracy were trying to minimize access to the vote in the past. We're a part of that. And so our work, unfortunately, requires us to be prepared for moments like that, where the forces that would seek to strip away the protections of our democracy seek to use violence or threats of violence in order to do so. And so onward we go, but recognizing that and finding great strength and serenity in knowing that my job is to protect the voters of the state of Michigan and make sure their voices are heard, all of them, every single one of them, regardless of how they vote or who they vote for. And I will proudly sign up to stand on the front lines and engage in whatever comes my way as a result of choosing an occupation in which I'm protecting democracy, in line with all of those who've made those same choices in the past.
Well, we're grateful for your public service, and I remember the language in the case law defining a public figure that defined that as someone who thrusts themselves into the vortex of public opinion. You've certainly done that, and one of our students is asking a question, and this will have to be the last one because we're running out of time. We have so many good questions, but this seems a fitting note to end on. The student says, what advice do you have for college students and young people who are fascinated by and looking to get into politics and yet are apprehensive due to political animosity in our country? In other words, why would anybody want to do what you're doing? And what advice do you have for someone who might still think it's the right thing to do?
I think if you're in any way dissatisfied with the state of affairs, and particularly leaders who feel are not adequately representing your views, you have a responsibility to step up and influence the process in some way, either as a voter, as an election administrator, or as a candidate for public office. It's a great opportunity to make sure you're a part of driving solutions forward, but it's also really the only way that things will get better. The only way. I think for me, when I looked as a law student and as a college student at a history of an injustice in our country on various policies that I felt were bad decisions by policymakers and the like, or court decisions that I felt were unjust, I realized that it's just people making those decisions, and they're people that have been given the power of the electorate, the power to make those decisions by voters. And so become one of those people and then do it right. For me, it was becoming a Secretary of State, seeing a lot of secretaries of state make bad decisions that hurt democracy. I became a lawyer because I thought I could, sue my way to protecting every vote, and then thought, well, what if I just was a Secretary of State and made the right decisions? And we saw this year how important it was to have people in places like secretaries of state positions that made the right decisions on both sides of the aisle. And we also saw what happens and what can happen when they don't, and when they follow politics or partisan agenda instead. So the only way we change that is to have more people in positions of authority that make the right decisions and act with integrity. And that's not you can do that on either side of the aisle, of course. So choose, if you want to be one of those people, choose to be engaged, to be involved. And it doesn't mean you have to spend your life in public service. It could mean you just run office and contribute and then go back to doing other things. I actually think that's a very good way to do it. But be involved, be engaged, because if you're not, and this is sort of the other side of that coin, if you're not only will nothing change, but if you're not, then your absence will create a void that will be filled by someone who may use that authority that you otherwise would have had in ways that would hurt the system that you want to protect. So know that you're in many ways, the only person who can advance your voice, your vision with integrity. But that if you choose not to do that, if you choose to stay silent or stay on the sidelines, others will come in and misuse the system in a way that will continue injustices that have happened historically throughout our country. Our country and our democracy is a living, breathing thing. It requires all of us to commit in every generation to keeping it strong. We certainly saw the importance of that over these past few months. But the only way we build off of that and move forward in a strong and healthy and robust way that protects our country for everyone is if we all step up and find all different ways that we can serve. And then the last thing I'll say on that is, in terms of getting involved, it may feel that you need a pedigree or money or people or networks or a name to be involved, but you actually don't. I was a law professor. I was a college student, and then I went to the South to do work in Montgomery, Alabama, went to law school to do civil rights law, and wrote a book on the Secretary of State office, began teaching, clerked for a judge, and then said, this is a job I want to do. And then all running for office really is convincing a majority of people who voted in an election that you're the right person for the job. And you can actually find a lot of joy in the authenticity of running for office in that regard. I love just going around the state of Michigan and telling people on both sides of the aisle, look, this is who I am. This is my vision. This is what I think this office should do. And then you ask for their vote. And even raising money in a campaign becomes actually not great challenge if you simply just are being authentic and believe in what you're trying to do. And then you can also find great joy in being part of the process. And again, keep in mind that the only way it improves, the only way it changes is with people of good faith and integrity choosing to step up and be a part of it. So please stay engaged, please run for office. And I'm happy to talk with anyone offline who has specific questions about getting engaged and involved.
Well, Jocelyn, I know I speak for many people at the college when I say that we thank you for your incurable optimism, for your commitment to democracy, for your belief in people, and for your encouraging words today. Our next session is for our students. It's a breakout session, begins at 2 o'clock. Students, I'll just remind you that you can go to my W&J to join those sessions. And then to all of our guests, I hope that you'll enjoy the break, and then please visit the agenda page for the link to join us this afternoon at 3 p.m. for a conversation with W&J graduate Pat Bennick, who's Director of Photography for United Press International in Washington, D.C., as he shares a presentation as an eyewitness to the insurrection at the Capitol on January the 6th. We hope to see you then. Again, thank you, Secretary Benson.
My pleasure. Thank you.